No two nations on Earth are any longer cut off from each other by geography. We all live at the edge of the same ocean, the air ocean which envelops the globe. And in the air age, geography has new meanings for the safety of the American and Canadian people.
The shortest route from the USSR, which was the prime antagonist in the Cold War against the USA, was over the Arctic. There's no other fastest route. And unfortunately for Canadians, when you looked at it, we're right in between these two forces that were saber-rattling and causing a lot of grief for each other. So it was natural that's where they would put it. And they wanted to be as close to Russia as they could be in order to get as much warning as they possibly could.
This was to build, with the cooperation of Canada, a radar early warning line north of the Arctic Circle. Starting at the northernmost tip of Alaska, it would stretch 3,000 miles across the continent to Baffin Island, opposite Greenland. Distant Early Warning Line, they named it. DEWLine, it became.
DEWLine was a string of radar stations that ran about 3,200 miles across the Arctic, about 200 miles inside the Arctic Circle. And there were 6 main stations where you might have about 50 to 80 people. There were 25 auxiliary sites where you might have up to 20 people. And then in between all of those stations were what were called intermediate sites, or I sites.
In this grim and forbidding Arctic waste, a top priority defense project is being rushed to completion. Known as Operation DEWLine, DEW for Distant Early Warning, it is the construction of a string of radar bases. Building in these frigid latitudes becomes a test of men and machines. Almost every type of terrain is encountered, from ice hundreds of feet thick to Arctic tundra.
If I remember correctly, it was around $500 million to build, which back then would be a lot of money. You can do the inflation corrections for today's dollars and cents. And it took about, I think it was around 20 or 30 months to build. So it was really an incredible engineering and construction feat.
The thickness of the ice must be tested for landing strips, and radio towers must withstand howling Arctic gales. On a tour of inspection of top secret bases, U.S. Secretary of Defense Wilson is joined by Defense Minister Campney and Defense Production Minister C.D. Howe of Canada and other members of the Joint Commission. The vast undertaking will cost $500 million and take 2 years to complete. These watchdogs, stretching 3,000 miles across the Arctic, are the price North America must pay for security. They will sound the first alarm should an air attack come.
The mass movement of supplies was done during the summer months, where they had the sea lift, and they would do that both on the east and west coast. And then there was continual resupply during the winter months by aircraft coming up from both Montreal, Winnipeg, and Edmonton as well, where centers were. So there was always what was called a vertical flight, which was the flight up, and then the lateral flights were the ones that went across the line. Generally, we'd get a plane once a week if weather held. Sometimes weather didn't hold.
The Arctic. Desolate, savage, remote. A wilderness of unending barren vistas. Through most of the year, locked in bitter cold and almost endless darkness.
The weather in the Arctic, I can sum it up in one word, which is cold, or 2 words, which is bitter cold. In the wintertime, certainly minus 40 was not uncommon, and you could take a glass of water outside and throw it up, and it never hit the ground. It just evaporated into vapor. It was so cold. So generally, cold is the word. In fact, once I froze to the point where I was actually praying that my feet would freeze and stop hurting because I was so cold. I was in a plane that I couldn't get off of.
In the camps of the construction contractors, living conditions were primitive. But already the crews were changing the face of that far north country. The Eskimos too were recruited, and they did a good job.
Dark for most of the winter months, and in the summer months, 100% light. And I used to actually have to nail a blanket up over my window in the summer months in order to simulate darkness so I could go to sleep.
Often the expression snowed in had a completely literal meaning. But nature in the Arctic no longer seems so savage. for life on the DEWLine had become pretty civilized.
Inside the buildings, life was good. We were very well fed. In fact, I gained 30 pounds on my first stint up, and the clothes that I had to wear to go south wouldn't fit anymore. So I actually sent away to Sears and mail order and bought a three-piece suit with 2 pair of pants and a television set for $29.95. I lied about the TV set, but it was $29.95 for a three-piece suit of clothes so I could actually have something to wear when I went out. We're well fed. We got movies generally when the planes arrive. We get about 2 to 3 movies a week. Some of them were first run. If you were stationed at a site, you would have a room of your own, about a 6-by-9 room, so it was fairly comfortable. If you were transient, which I was for a lot of my time, you simply got whatever you could. But I primarily slept inside the buildings. I didn't have to sleep outside, which some people did. We had what are called at-will tents, and they would sleep outside. That got rarer and rarer as time went by, and we'd try to house people in transient quarters.
Spring baseball practice started early. While you were working up an appetite, the chef would be doing something about it. After dinner, it was each man to his own pleasure. It might be music. Perhaps you preferred a rousing game of table tennis, no quarter given. You could curl up with a good book. Or there was that other fine intellectual pastime called poker. No quarter given here either.
There was a sense of we're all in this boat together, but what you really had was a group of nomads all sort of clustered together. And when you consider that when you were on your shift or doing your duty roster, you were on with one other person. Now he'd be watching the radar while you're looking after the equipment and vice versa. So you didn't even really get a chance to chat with that person for any extended period of time unless you wanted to. So what you had on a station of 15 was probably 14 loners. And one social person was going crazy trying to find somebody who would talk to him.
What if someone at Civil Defense pushed the right button, and this is not a practice alert, but warning of a real enemy attack? And if it is a real attack, how will the United States cope with it? The answer begins thousands of miles to the north, at the DEWLine, the Distant Early Warning System, a network of radars which stretches some 5,000 miles.
It was certainly sobering. You had a sense that not so much that you were leading edge in terms of technology, but you were certainly leading edge in terms of what was happening in the world. And you also recognized that you were a very thin line between letting people know that the end was going to be coming. And to that end, it really did cause you to take the job very seriously. Things were very tight. On one case, if you ever missed a plane, there was no what happened, it was just goodbye. You just got put on a plane and sent south. You did not fall asleep at the console. That was the kiss of death. People took that very seriously.
Immediately upon detection, the information would be flashed to the Combat Operations Center of NORAD, the North American Air Defense Command, buried deep in the heart of Cheyenne Mountain near Colorado Springs. NORAD's mission is to defend Canada and the United States against aerospace attack.
Our reporting processes was that on every council there was a message sender, and we would dial in the information. Whenever we saw a plane come down, we would do 2 or 3 paints on it in order to get the direction and speed. And we were never told what was coming. I mean, they would know. And so we would report it, and then if it was a known aircraft, they would say it's Scandinavian 935, and continue to track. If it was an unknown, they would say unknown, continue to track every 3 minutes, and we would send reports in every 3 minutes. Those reports went to the main stations, from all the outside stations into the main station. Main station would have direct communication with NORAD down in Cheyenne Mountain.
When the unknowns enter the NORAD area of responsibility, the Commander-in-Chief, NORAD, will declare an air defense emergency. And United States and Canadian long-range fighter interceptors will be launched. First, to identify the aircraft, and, if found hostile, to destroy them.
Basically, our job would have been over in about 30 minutes, because that's about the time it would have taken from a fairly fast aircraft to go from the top of the radar scope to the bottom. So as soon as we picked it up, which might be a couple hundred miles out, and we painted 2 or 3 paints on the screen. We then knew the speed and the direction, and that would be reported. And if it was an unknown, they would continue to track it. They would try to identify from all the sources that they knew, where this aircraft come from. It wouldn't be one aircraft. I mean, in my mind, it would have been a whole series of them coming down. So you would have seen all kinds of them right across the line. And then after they went off the bottom of the scope, that's it. Our job was done. We'd raised the flag, gave them the call, and basically our hope is that someone would come and get us and take us out of there.
By order from the White House, you are authorized
With
to
the decision made, the United States will now strike back with a counteroffensive unparalleled in the history of war. Airborne bombers of Strategic Air Command will be ordered to take full reprisal against the enemy's homeland. Others will roar off to the attack from SAC bases located around the world.
Cuban Missile Crisis was, first of all, for me, the most exciting time up there. We recognize the darkness on the horizon.
Unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
Frankly, a lot of us didn't think we were going to come home from there. We felt that we would get left behind. We doubled up on the consoles. That means we watched both of the upper and the lower beams, where normally we would only watch the lower beam. And there was increased activity by the Strategic Air Command. We were sending the emergency action message, which is basically the fail-safe message, on a much more frequent basis. So we had our finger on the pulse while watching what was happening. It was tense and interesting.
The missile age is here, a new and grim challenge to the free world, a challenge to our very survival. We must keep ahead of communist efforts to dominate the world. We must have missiles of all types for all purposes, to protect our own country, to protect the free nations of the world, to preserve peace.
The major turning point was the intercontinental missile, and they did incorporate the DEWLine into what was called the BMU system, which is the Ballistic Missile Early Warning System.
While still thousands of miles away, the missiles would be detected by BMUs, the Ballistic Missile Early Warning System. Instantly, BMUs would flash the warning to NORAD and to MAR, indicating the speed, direction, and number of attacking missiles. MAR would then detect, track, and identify the real warheads from the decoys in microseconds. At the proper moment, Zeus would be blasted from its silo.
And we basically became a communication channel between those two sites. That's probably the biggest thing that caused it to die. Also nowadays, a bomb in a box is much more threatening than something coming over the pole. Certainly submarine-launched missiles are going to get you within 18 minutes or so.
But perhaps the true historical role of the DEWLine will prove to be the opening up for peaceful and productive purposes of a vast new frontier above the Arctic Circle, the untapped resources of which we have as yet barely glimpsed. That would be the finest reward of all for the men who built the DEWLine.
There's a lot of Cold War history around. I think that I'd like to see it remembered as probably a group of hardy folks that were in the coldest part of the Cold War. It didn't get any colder, and there was no Cold War down south. We were up there as that thin line of people between the Russians and the Americans, hoping to give people enough notice to do something should the disaster happen.